Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. I'd like to talk to you about Sony's firmware update for the A7 III and the A7R3 cameras. This is version 3 and was released in April 2019. If you're wanting to catch up with me after this presentation, just head over to markgaylor.com. All of my learning support materials for the Alpha systems is available for free. Okay, so if you're looking to see what version you're currently running on your camera, just head into the menus, click on the version in the Setup 7 tab, and then that will allow you to see the version you're currently running. Now, version 3, as I said, will bring in a couple of new features that it's definitely worth upgrading to if you're running a version 2 or earlier. Now, if you're looking to access this firmware, just head over to Sony's website, hit the support link at the top of the page, and then in the search field just type in ILCE- and then 7M3 or 7RM3 into that search field. You should then be able to find access to the download for either Mac or Windows that you're currently running. Now, Brian Smith, a Sony artisan in the USA, has a great guide to updating your firmware if this is your first time. Mac owners, it's a two-step process. You first have to run through the update setting tool and then go inside of that resources folder to access that. Earlier versions of the Mac operating system and Windows, it's a little bit simpler. So one of the great new improvements has been to IAF. Now, I'm already a big fan of IAF, especially in continuous autofocus. When working with wide aperture primes, it always allows me to snap focus on the eye very quickly and very reliably, and I can move or the model continue to move, and I will have a reliable and good success rate at getting very sharp images which are focused on the leading eye typically. Now, one of the improvements to IAF, it's called Evolved IAF, is that we no longer have to hold down a custom key to activate IAF in continuous autofocus. This has been a much requested feature and it is now available via this firmware upgrade. Now, if you've got multiple subjects in your frame, just remember you can choose which subject that the camera will snap onto and use its IF just by putting a flexible spot nearest the subject that you want the camera to snap focus on. You don't have to put that flexible spot actually on the eye. You just move it to the person closest that you want the camera to focus on. Now, some people might think that you never need to turn IAF off, so I thought I'd just highlight some of the reasons you may want to turn IAF off. Now, in this example, I'm actually holding down a custom key on a previous firmware version in order to track this guy who's about to receive a ball at an AFL match. Now, what happens is because his arm temporarily obscured his face and I'm using a wider focus area, the camera jumped from my primary subject that it was following to a better target, a face that is closer to the center of the AF area. Now, I was using zone, and as the player moves off to the right, it jumps focus to the best face nearest the center. So if this is going to be a problem for you, then I would recommend that you put the face IAF into a function menu or assign it to a custom key. Basically what would happen is as soon as that the primary target, the figure that you're following, moves back towards the center and the eye is visible, the camera will snap back on. But in some instances, when you're tracking sports and you've got multiple players on a pitch, then you don't want the risk of losing your target. Typically in version 2 there was no menu item for IAF. It was only appeared when you were assigning a custom key to it. Now, however, it does appear in the AF2 panel or tab, and so we have a dedicated menu to face registration and IAF. If we go in and hit the center button in the control wheel, we'll go in and look at some of those options. Now there we can see we can switch it on or off. Now typically most of the time you'll probably want to leave it on, but as I've outlined, there will be an instance where you may want to turn it off. Now coming into the menus to turn it off might be take longer than you want. So as I said, I would actually go into the function menu and then go and program a couple of the spaces on that function menu for quick access. So I've programmed it to my upper 4 face eye priority. I've also put in subject detection as well. This is a linked feature for face IAF because we now have human IAF or animal IAF. Okay, so once you've done that, it's a quick matter just to press the FN key, move your multi-selector or joystick over to that item, and then using the front dial we can quickly switch from human to animal IAF. And this is one of the other great new features about the version 3 firmware update. Now I've seen lots of examples online of people snapping focus on their favorite pet's eyes, especially dogs and cats, and this will move the focus beyond the nose, which typically is what the camera would focus on if we're using a wide focus area. I have to say that when my subject is stationary, I've just used a flexible spot to move that onto the eye of the subject. So although this is a little bit easier for people working with wider AF areas such as zone or wide, it is an improvement to the ease of working. Now where I really wanted to test it was with dogs moving, because this is a much more difficult circumstance when we're trying to put a flexible spot on a rapidly moving target. Now I have to say that this is the first iteration of Animal IAF, and I had mixed success. Occasionally the Animal IAF would bow out, it would disappear, and then again it would snap back in. So it was an intermittent feature. I have to say that any help in these situations is very useful, so I did enjoy using it and seeing that it would snap on some of the time and follow that focus in continuous autofocus. Now we don't have access to the lock-on AF options with Animal IAF, not with this release anyway. So I would just advise selecting a zone or wide AF area and then let the camera snap the animal's AF if it can. Okay, so as I said, I had some good success there with my first outing using Animal IF. I did notice that when the subject moves very, very close, this is an uncropped image, because of the depth of field, and maybe it's just a little bit slower than human IF, sometimes the focus was just a little bit behind the eyes. Until such a version firmware increases the speed and reliability of Animal IF, I would just advise maybe stopping down to F8 when your subject is very close to the camera, thereby extending the depth of field enough for it to cover basically the eyes as well as maybe the ears. So as I said, I had good success with there, occasionally with fast moving subjects as well, so I'm really pleased to see that. Now Animal IF won't see all animals yet, so I'm hoping that Sony will build the range of animals that it can detect. The holy grail for me would it be being able to track a bird in flight, because that is perhaps the most difficult animal to track when they're moving rapidly. Another new feature that has made appearance with the version 3 update is interval shooting. Now we can make time-lapse movies using the S and Q feature in these cameras, and that makes a movie in the camera. But for time-lapse where we want to make the movie in post-production, maybe we're a RAW shooter and we want that increased dynamic range, then interval shooting allows us to create a series of stills that we can then make into a time-lapse movie in post-production. Interval shooting function is where you're going to look to start this feature. Again, just press the center button in the middle of the control wheel to look at your options in here. Now you'll just basically switch it from off to on if you're ready to use it, and then when you finish using it, just switch it off. Now we do have a shooting start time, so we can press the shutter release if we don't have a cable release, and we can set 1 or 2 seconds just so there's no vibration vibration in that first shot. Okay, the shooting interval, you can select your own interval in between each frame. Now typically you might start at maybe 1 second if maybe clouds or people are moving rapidly through your scene, and you're given the shooting time in order to shoot the number of frames that you've also selected. Okay, in this instance or this example that I'm showing here, it would take 20 minutes to shoot this sequence if we've got an interval of 5 seconds and I'm shooting 250 shots. Now you're going to want 250 or 3 shots just to make a 10-second clip if you're playing that back at 25 or 30 frames per second. So you are going to want to select a reasonable number of frames for a reasonable length clip. Okay, so I've got some tips for shooting time-lapse if this is something that you haven't done before. First of all, I would perhaps start with a newly formatted card, especially if you want to shoot maybe thousands of shots for a very extended time-lapse clip. I would also set the aspect ratio to 16:9 because that is going to be the shape of a movie that you output. Now you can shoot in the 3:2 aspect ratio, but when we're creating a movie for screens, then typically you are going to want to fill that screen and using the 16:9 aspect ratio. So setting it in camera first just allows you to compose the image a little bit more carefully, so you're not including stuff that you will then probably have to crop out if you wanted to crop in post. I would typically use an aperture wider than f8 because if you're using say f11, f16 and your sensor's not completely clean, then you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of frames that will need cleaning, i.e. dust removal from that sensor. So typically a lot of those dust spots will not be visible when using apertures wider than f8. Now I would also advise shooting stills in the raw file format. This is going to give you increased dynamic range, and then we can process those images for the shadows and highlights in post-production before making the movie clip. I would also ensure the camera is on a sturdy tripod, and the tripod won't be able to pick up any vibration such as through the ground. Maybe a boardwalk on a pier would be a bad place to put your tripod if people are moving across those wooden boards. Basically you'd get some vibration coming through your time-lapse clip. Okay, so why RAW? Okay, so this is the same image before and after processing, and this is the great advantage of using creating a time-lapse movie from raw stills, is because we can put in graduated filters, we can enhance the tone, contrast, clarity, put in a little bit of vignette perhaps, so we can really optimize all of those stills before assembling that time-lapse clip. So number of shots, as I've said, is going to make a significant difference. Now typically when I'm making movies, I'm playing back at 25 frames per second. Now you may, in America, you might be playing back at 24 or 30 frames per second. So just do the maths on that one. Just remember you're going to need 24 or 25 frames for every second of your time-lapse movie. So maybe 25 or 50 frames in total isn't going to be long enough for your time-lapse clip. Okay, so as I said there, you will get an overview of how long it will take. I will typically extend the interval to 5 or maybe even 10 seconds. If I look at the clouds in a landscape and they're barely moving, I am going to start extending that interval out. Now, as soon as you start extending over 5 seconds, you are going to be there for a period of time, so you might want to take a camping chair and maybe a sandwich and some coffee because you are going to be sitting by your tripod for a significant amount of time. So one of the things that I really want to talk about when shooting images, still images for a time-lapse clip, is carefully choosing the shutter speed. This really becomes the priority when we're making movies rather than stills. Ideally we want a little bit of movement blur, so the movie plays back very smoothly. Typically in the movie industry they usually use a shutter speed that's maybe double the frame rate. So if we're shooting at 24 frames per second, we'd choose a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, which is close to that double. Sometimes it's referred to as the 180-degree angle. Okay, so that is the traditional way of shooting movies, just with a small amount of movement blur. Now, if we're going to start extending the interval out, I typically will start extending my shutter speed out as well. So if my interval is say 2 seconds, I will start looking to try and create a shutter speed of 1 second. 50% of the interval rate. Now in bright conditions you will need to carry an ND filter because otherwise overexposure will result when using those longer shutter speeds in bright ambient conditions. So that is maybe worth looking at when you get into time-lapse photography. Now if you're working with fading sunlight or sunrise, and this is going to be your first outing doing time-lapse, I would typically look at using maybe aperture priority and let the camera move the exposure over the duration of each individual frame. Now more experienced time-lapse photographers will actually use manual. They'll use a manual white balance and manual exposure. And just remember, if you are using manual exposure, also go into the ISO and set that to a fixed ISO rather than auto ISO as well. We're going to create smoother movies, less flicker. However, when shooting in fully manual mode at the beginning of the day where it's getting brighter, or at the end of the day where it's getting darker, you will need to use post-production software to ramp the exposure over that period of time. A little bit more complex. So just go semi-auto, aperture priority or shutter priority if this is your first experience with time-lapse photography. There is one of the problems of using auto. These two frames are only captured 1 frame apart, but you can see how significantly different they are when using auto exposure. You can reduce the effects of this by setting the AE tracking sensitivity to low if you don't want rapid changes in exposure. Okay, so this will create a small flicker if uncorrected in post. So the good news about creating the movie in post-production is you don't need to spend any additional money for software. Sony's Imaging Edge software will allow you to create the time-lapse movie from your stills. You can also do this with a mixture of Photoshop and Lightroom as well. And I do have a movie on my YouTube channel about how to create a time-lapse movie using Lightroom and Photoshop if you'd prefer to do that rather than using Sony's Imaging Edge app. So one of the other features that's linked to the interval shooting inside the new firmware is in the playback menu. If we go to the page 4 there, you'll see that we can actually preview the movie in the camera before we actually make it in post-production. So this is a good way of maybe deciding on a slightly different interval by playing it back in the camera just to see whether we've chosen an interval that's appropriate time. If you're looking to get to grips with all of the information about your A7III, A7R3, just remember on my website in the ebook section, the downloads ebooks, I do have a free 240-page ebook which links out to 35 YouTube movies, and so this will help you master. You don't have to read every page, you can just cherry pick to the sections that you want to learn how to master in your particular camera. If you find that incredibly useful, you could make a small donation, but it is a free download. If you're looking to ask lots of questions via social media, then I would encourage you to maybe become a paid member of my YouTube channel. I have tried in the past to answer all questions on my YouTube channel, but this is becoming increasingly difficult as the popularity of the channel increases. So I set up this membership. It typically costs less than $5 a month to join and become a member. And I certainly prioritize the questions from the paid members, and I run a monthly live 1-hour Q&A session where I answer everybody's questions about the Alpha systems. Okay, so and if you're wanting to work with me in flesh, live in person, then I do the occasional workshop. My next one is just in a few weeks time, well actually next week, and that's probably sold out now, but I do have one on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia in November. So just head out to World Photo Adventures and look for the November in the Australia section. Lady Elliot Island, it's a very small coral cay on the southernmost end of the Great Barrier Reef. That certainly should be part of your bucket list photo tours if you like getting out and about with a camera, and you want to meet myself and also another Sony advocate, Fraser Leal.